Hello everybody, Mike Westfall here with McDonald Garden Center. Hope you're all having a great day. Today we're going to be doing tips and tricks for pruning your hydrangeas. So we've done webinars in the past and seminars about hydrangeas, and it is a humongous topic. So we're going to try and pare it down here a little bit and just kind of get into the specifics of pruning your hydrangeas, because it's one of the #1 questions we get here when talking about hydrangeas is how do I prune them, when do I prune them, and I've pruned them and I haven't gotten any blooms. And I think that's the most common thing is somebody prunes their hydrangea and then the next year they don't get blooms. So we're going to kind of get a little bit in depth into how to diagnose that and then when to prune. I think that's the most important thing here is when to prune. The nice thing is hydrangeas are pretty resilient plants. Even if you mess up, you might not get blooms one year, but the plant is still going to thrive and do perfectly fine. So we'll talk about that a little bit. All right, so as we get started, we've got to get some tools, right? So we're going to need some tools to do this job, no matter what time of the year that I'll tell you when to prune your hydrangeas. But these are some of the main tools that you might use. So we've got a pair of handheld bypass pruners. That's really important that they're bypass pruners, that the blades kind of cross rather than those old-fashioned anvil pruners that most of you probably can't even find anymore. But anvil pruners crush the stem. Bypass pruners are like scissors, and they're going to cut the stem nice and clean. Then you've got your head shears. Not probably going to use those too much in hydrangeas. I'll talk about where you could use those from time to time. Lopping shears are the bigger bypass, basically pruning shears to help you cut into some bigger branches if needed. So we've got those. You're definitely going to need pruners. That's probably the most important thing is you're going to need some pruners. And then you're going to need maybe a pair of gloves. So that's a good thing. Is grab a pair of gloves because you might need those. A rake is going to come in pretty handy. I love our expandable rake, our adjustable rake. It makes it really, really nice and easy to kind of get in and out of nooks and crannies. And then maybe like a bucket or a wheelbarrow or maybe a tarp just to kind of collect all your cuttings to get them to the compost pile or into the dumpster, wherever you might be disposing of them. But that is kind of some of the tools you're going to need. It's pretty basic, pretty simple. You just need basically a pair of pruners and then a way to clean up your mess because you might make a mess. So here's the most important thing is the types of hydrangeas. And this is where it gets a little bit kind of hard to understand and can get a little confusing because there's lots and lots of varieties of hydrangeas. So we've got numerous varieties out there. You've probably heard of Endless Summer, maybe Nantucket Blue, Annabelle Lee, Incredible, Limelight, Oak Leaf, all of these different varieties of hydrangeas. Alice is a very common one in the Oak Leaf family. So lots and lots of varieties of hydrangeas, but it's important to know the type of your hydrangea. So we're going to get into that in a little bit more specifics so that I can show you, and I'll show you lots of examples and pictures. So there's 4 main species of hydrangeas. We've got our big leaf or mop head hydrangeas, which is the most commonly grown hydrangeas because you can get them in blues and pinks and even mauves and kind of different colors. And they're coming out with so many different varieties. They also come in lace cap as well. I'll show you images of that. Then you've got your paniculata or panicle. It's kind of an easier way of saying it. And that's what these guys are. Most commonly, limelight hydrangeas are going to be your panicle or paniculatas. And then you've got your oak leaf hydrangeas, that farther one over there. Also kind of a panicle-shaped bloom, but oak leaf, which means it's got these kind of indentations around the leaf, and it looks kind of like an oak leaf. Great hydrangea. And then you've got your smooth hydrangeas up there in the corner. Typically white hydrangeas, maybe a little bit of lime. You might see some pink ones as well, but smaller blooms typically and lots of them, kind of a bigger kind of perfectly globe-shaped hydrangea. Those are actually native to the southeastern part of the United States, so a native to the U.S. Plant, hydrangea. The oak leaf is also a native to North America. So we've got some great hydrangeas to talk about. Those are the four species, and that can be pretty simplified. However, we're going to throw one kind of wrinkle into the mix, and that's going to be in the mop head, the big leaf hydrangeas, the most commonly grown hydrangea. You've got 2 different types, and you've got repeat bloomers, and then you've got your traditional. Some might call them French, some might just call them mop heads, but you got repeat bloomers, and those are going to be the new ones. Endless Summers, Nantucket Blue, as I mentioned, lots of new ones coming out from Monrovia. And Endless Summer is constantly putting out new varieties. This new one this year is called Pop Star, and so that one's a little bit of a dwarf lace cap, and it just constantly blooms and stays nice and tidy and small. So There's a huge amount of varieties in these. The cool thing and kind of the easy thing to remember is if you bought a hydrangea in the past few years, most likely you bought a repeat bloomer. I'm not saying there's not some old-fashioned traditional bloomers out there that maybe you've purchased. Maybe you just purchased it because it was pretty and it was blooming. Sometimes our florist hydrangeas are going to be kind of that kind of style. So if you bought one that's kind of grown as a floral plant, like sometimes maybe you'll buy it in a house plant department. Sometimes those are your old-fashioned hydrangeas. Maybe you bought a house that has a bunch of hydrangeas that were planted 20 years ago, and those are probably going to be your old-fashioned French, big leaf, mop head types of hydrangeas. Your repeat blooming hydrangeas are pretty much anything that you bought in the past 5 to 10 years, most likely. But the most important thing is understanding what type you have, because each one is going to have different pruning times. And so we'll get into that a little bit here in just a second. So what does that mean? Well, new wood versus old wood is probably what you hear a lot. And that can be confusing to understand too. So what is the difference between new wood and old wood? And what we mean when we say that from a garden center's perspective is, what is it going to bloom on? Is it going to bloom on new wood, or is it going to bloom on old wood? So new wood, if it blooms on new wood, and you'll see that maybe even on your tag sometimes, if it blooms on new wood, it's going to bloom on this year's growth. So everything new this year means it's going to bloom on it. If it's going to bloom on old wood, it's going to bloom on the growth this year, next year. So let me explain that a little bit further. If we go back to our old-fashioned hydrangeas, which is this guy right up here, those are going to be big bloom sets, and they're going to bloom on last year's growth. So all of those blooms that you see up there are coming from last year's new growth, but it's old wood, because it has gone through a winter season. They start to set their buds for next year at the end of the summer season typically. And so right around fall time, they're setting their buds. And if you go and cut those hydrangeas in the winter, you're not going to get any blooms because you cut them all off. Now your new repeat blooming hydrangeas, they're going to bloom on new wood and old wood, which means that you can prune them really anytime. But we're going to get into pruning specifics here in just a second. So that is really the biggest difference. New wood versus old wood. It's going to bloom on new wood. If it says new wood, then it's going to bloom this year on the growth that it gets this year, which means you've really got a little bit easier pruning job there. Old wood means that it's going to bloom on last year's growth. So we've got to be a little bit more careful with those. And I'm going to go a little bit more into specifics there, because I want you to be able to identify what type of hydrangea you have. So I see, like Susanna said, mine's old-fashioned French big leaf, came with the house. Exactly. I've got one just like you, Susanna. And so let's talk about that first, because I think that is probably one of the hardest ones to understand, and it's the most commonly grown hydrangea out there. So repeat bloomers are going to be a little bit easier. Let's get that one out of the way. This is an endless summer hydrangea, repeat blooming hydrangea. And that means it's going to bloom on new wood and old wood. So how can you identify whether yours is a repeat bloomer versus an old fashioned or a French or big leaf, just a common hydrangea? Well, you might be able to tell because of the bloom set. So an old-fashioned hydrangea is going to be a big amount of blooms, typically right at the beginning of, right around the mid-May period in the southeastern part here of Virginia. Depends on where you live. I know we've got people watching in Maine and Florida, so you got different times. But basically, an older-fashioned hydrangea is going to put one big bloom set out, and that's about it. It's going to kind of hold on to that color for a while. It's going to start to fade. I've got a great picture that I'll show you here in a second. But a newer hydrangea, one that's a repeat blooming hydrangea, is going to look something like this. You've got older blooms and you've got new blooms that you can see all the way over there, right? Let me go this way. Right here, you can see those new ones coming with older ones on there. And that means it's a repeat blooming variety, which means it's going to constantly be blooming throughout the season. Maybe you don't get quite as huge of a bloom set, but you're going to get a lot of blooms consistently throughout the entire late spring through the summer, even into fall. So that means it's a repeat bloomer. So what I like to do is I like to group these kind of all in the same category as when to prune them. Let's keep on going to identify before I get to that point. So here you go. Here's another big leaf variety. This is an old fashioned. So you can see it's got longer growth, usually bigger blooms. That's another great kind of sign if you've got an old fashioned hydrangea. Typically you're going to have bigger blooms Even on that one big bloom set, you're gonna have bigger blooms. And you can see this one basically has nothing but large blooms. You got a couple little, smaller ones coming, one here, one up here. So you've got a couple smaller ones, but basically it's a big bloom set. They're all pretty good size. That's usually a good sign that's an old-fashioned hydrangeas. You've also got lace caps in this group too, just to make it even more confusing, right? So lace cap hydrangeas are going to be where a bloom, basically the petals or the blooms on the interior are sterile and don't open up all the way. So you've got all the petals open up just on the exterior of the bloom, as you can see here. And those are called lace cap hydrangeas, and they're becoming very, very popular. They're very different looking, but they're still in the big leaf family. So they're still in that mop head big leaf family of hydrangeas, which means, do they bloom on new wood or old wood? Well, guess what? There's both. There's still old-fashioned lace caps out there, and there's still new repeat bloomer lace caps out there. So again, kind of confusing. The best telltale sign is big bloom set, usually larger blooms. And then if you've got a repeat blooming variety, you should see blooms consistently throughout the season. And the best way to kind of really tell is give it a season. And if you're like, I've really got to prune this thing, I've really got to cut it down to size, I'll tell you the best time to prune them, whether you don't know or whether you do know. But if you can let it go one season, that one season will tell you. You get a big bloom set, it's an old-fashioned, and it kind of fizzles out and doesn't do much after that, old-fashioned hydrangea. If you get a repeat bloomer, you're going to get less blooms typically right at the beginning, but you'll get them consistently throughout the entire season. So that's how you can kind of tell in this kind of huge family. So I know we've got a couple comments there. So let's see. Oh, Haglund said, ours is an old-fashioned hydrangea, large blooms, but just for a short period of time. Great. So now you've identified it. So when do we prune big leaf hydrangeas? Let's get the old-fashioned one out of the way, because this is the most important one. You've got to prune them when they start to look like this, when we still have time for them to grow. So I love this picture. I know it's not the prettiest picture in the world, but what it shows you is as these blooms start to fade, so this old-fashioned hydrangea is starting to fizzle, all these blooms are starting to kind of decay over time. That's kind of natural. What some people will do with an old-fashioned hydrangea is leave them on there. And then you can have some dried flowers for winter arrangements if you want to use them. That's perfectly fine. But you got to control the size. Let's say this is 6 foot high and I got to get it back down to like 4 feet. So I got to prune this to control the size. When do I do it? Well, you got to do it in mid to late summer when the blooms start to look like this. Enjoy the blooms. Don't do it right after it blooms. Enjoy the blooms. Let them bloom. Let them do their thing. Bring some in for cut flowers. But then go and prune it so that you have enough time, enough warmth, enough time for it to grow so that it can put out new growth this year, and then that way you'll get blooms next year. So that's when you want to prune an old-fashioned hydrangea, because it's only going to bloom it's only going to bloom next year on this year's growth. So we got to give it time to regrow. Best practice is to never prune more than a third of the shrub if at all possible. So if I've got a 6-foot shrub and I want to make it 4 feet, you'll be perfectly fine pruning it at 4, but it's going to grow another foot next year. So it's kind of going to be a process. With an older hydrangea, one that you've maybe had in the ground for a long time, if you purchased a house, as somebody mentioned, then you probably are going to be fine pruning it at about 50%. So you can take a 6-foot shrub and cut it back to 3 foot. If you want to be aggressive and go down to 2 feet, that's probably as low as I would possibly go. Typically, hydrangeas are going to grow about a foot, maybe 2 feet a year, depending on the variety. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we get further. But a big leaf hydrangea typically is going to grow right around 8 to 12 inches a year. Sometimes faster, sometimes slower, depending on Mother Nature and depending on where you live. But that's typical for a big leaf mop head type of hydrangea, about 8 to 12 inches. So that'll give you some idea of how far you're going to prune it. Now it might look ugly for about a month. What you would want to do is if you're doing a pretty hard prune on it to control the size, give it a little plant food afterwards. It could be any kind of all-purpose, holly tone works really, really well for hydrangeas, especially if you want that blue color. It'll make it a little bit more acidic. But an all-purpose fertilizer is going to be perfectly fine. And what that does is just kind of help regenerate growth, get that new wood out so that you've got blooms for next year. All right, so let's go back to a repeat bloomer. So repeat blooming hydrangeas, you can do them the same way as an old-fashioned. So if you want to be safe with your mop head hydrangeas, the best thing to do is wait for that first big bloom set, because repeat bloomers will still kind of have that. give it a good little prune, and then it'll be perfectly fine. Because typically what happens with a repeat bloomer is if you prune it in the winter, you're actually pruning half of your first blooms out because they do bloom on new wood and old wood. So I really feel like pruning a repeat bloomer mid to late summer is the best option because it still allows it more time to grow and put out new wood, and then you get more blooms next year. So I like to categorize mop heads, big leaf hydrangeas, all in the same category. Do it sometime in that midsummer time frame. You want to catch, maybe a couple days where it's nice and cool if you can get that, just so we don't burn some of that interior foliage, because that interior foliage is really, really used to being very, very shaded. And then we're going to cut all that exterior foliage off, and some of that interior foliage can get charred up a little bit. But as I mentioned, hydrangeas are resilient and very, very easy plants to grow. So hopefully some of those tips help you identify whether you've got an old-fashioned or a repeat blooming hydrangea. And I like to group them all into the same category. If you ever prune a big leaf mop head type of hydrangea in the winter and you get no blooms next year, then you know you've got an old-fashioned hydrangea. Next year, it's just gonna be a green shrub. Let it grow. Don't touch it, and then the next year after that, you're gonna get lots and lots of blooms. So that's perfectly fine, and then you know, hey, I gotta prune it in that mid to late summer time frame. So hopefully that didn't confuse you more. Hopefully that makes it pretty simple, and we'll go on to the next one because we've got three more categories here to talk about. So we've got oak leaf hydrangeas, one of my all-time favorite hydrangeas. Oak leaf hydrangeas are kind of a native species to North America. It is a very, very pretty hydrangea. They can actually take a little bit more sun than your typical hydrangeas. I didn't mention sunlight, but hydrangeas in general like to be in a little bit of shade. But oak leaves can take a little bit more sun. I still like them in a little bit of shade, and they look great in a woodland setting. With pine trees or oaks or maples around, river birch, when you got big shade trees and you want to plant a bunch of oak leaf hydrangeas, they're absolutely stunning. Typically, you really don't have to prune these too much. They're not super, super fast growers, but they can get good size. They can get 6 to 8 feet sometimes. They have really pretty exfoliating bark, but when do we prune oak leaf hydrangeas? Well, they only bloom on old growth. So an easy one to kind of remember. Oak leaf hydrangeas, we gotta prune after that bloom set. So if we're trying to control size, or maybe we just wanna knock it down just a little bit, or maybe we wanna limit up into a little bit of a tree, we always wanna prune after these blooms start to fade a little bit. Midsummer, late summer, perfect time to get out there and prune these guys if we need to. I like to let oak leaves go, so if you can plant them in a spot that they can get nice and big and kind of do their own thing, they're very natural looking, and they have some great fall and winter color. So really, really great year-round kind of hydrangea. But blooms on old wood only. So don't get this one confused with this guy. We're going to talk about this one next, the Paniculata. So we want to do oak leaf first. So here's another picture of another oak leaf. So you can see that oak leaf, really, really nice, different leaf. All hydrangeas typically have just kind of a simple leaf structure. This is going to be a dissected leaf, so it's going to have that kind of oak-shaped leaf. Maybe even some people might call it a maple leaf, but it's more on the oak-looking side. So that is the only hydrangea that really, really has that kind of deeply dissected leaf that you see there. So that's a great image of how that hydrangea will naturally grow and with that leaf on there. So you can identify those if you have some of those in your garden already. It's a great one. If you don't, you'll love it. It's really, really stunning. It's very, very different looking. Love those blooms, and they can get huge. I mean, they can get, probably up to, 18 inches long. Really, really pretty hydrangea. But only blooms on old wood, which means we've got to let it regrow after a bloom or after we prune it. So we got to give it enough time to regrow, go through the winter season, and then it'll bloom again in the spring. All right, let's go to the Panicle or the Paniculata. So these are great. There's a huge category of these. These are becoming extremely popular nowadays because they're one of the most hardcore hydrangeas out there. They're very, very easy to grow. They can actually take almost full sun. In fact, some people prefer them in full sun because they'll bloom a little bit heavier. Sometimes you might see them kind of wilting and hanging, but they are very, very tough plants. So they make a great one. If you just plant a Paniculata, the most important thing is to get it through that first summer, especially if you're planting it in full sun. Make sure to give it ample amounts of water because they will need it. But Paniculatas, Panicles, easy. They bloom on new wood only. So that means you can prune them in the winter, you can prune them in the spring. You really can prune them any time. I think the best time to prune them is that late winter time frame. I typically love to get out in the garden in February and prune certain plants that I know I'm safe, like butterfly bush, roses, and my paniculatas. So great time to get out there and prune these. I'll show you a couple more images so you can see a close-up of this bloom. Usually sometimes, the limelight is one of the most popular varieties out there because it comes out in this kind of limey growth at first, this lime-colored bloom. And so that's kind of a little bit of a close-up of it. And then you've got a little bit of a bigger bloom here that's kind of starting to age a little bit. You can even see up here in this corner, it's got a little bit of a blush. Sometimes they'll blush to a little bit of blue or a little bit of pink, typically more pink. And there's new ones coming out that have kind of this even more intense kind of pink color in there as well. So there's lots and lots of varieties of paniculatas, Panicle style hydrangeas. The nice thing about them is they're easy. They can grow in sun or shade. Some people say they bloom a little bit better in sun, to each his own. I think they bloom great wherever you plant them. And the nice thing is you can prune them in the winter when they're bare shrubs and you're kind of like, it looks ugly, it's a big bare shrub, I want to prune it back. This one you can. And you can actually prune these pretty hard. So you can prune them up to half, is typically what I recommend. These grow 12 to 24 inches in a season. So if you're trying to keep it at 4 feet, you might have to prune it to 2 feet almost every year and cycle in some old wood. Go in and cut some old canes out. If you got crossing branches, broken branches, get some of that out, cut it back, get it to about 24 inches, maybe 36 inches from the ground, and let it regrow each season. And do that right around February, March timeframe, at least in the Hampton Roads area in the southeastern part of Virginia. But basically, you want to prune it back and allow that sap to kind of heal those wounds, and then come back and let it regenerate growth fairly quickly after that. They'll start to kind of leaf out here in our neck of the woods, typically right around that mid-March timeframe. And then, of course, by mid-May, they're blooming like crazy. So great varieties, really, really easy one to remember. And then smooth hydrangeas. So this is the other one that we talked about, was smooth hydrangeas. Now this is going to be like your Annabelle Lees, your Incrediballs, Invincibles. There's lots and lots of varieties of smooth hydrangeas. This one is the native one. You probably aren't going to find as many of these in garden centers. They typically look better in the ground than they do in a container, which is why. Now these really have some humongously round-shaped blooms on them. And typically they're on a little bit of a weaker stem, which is why they're not quite as popular, because they tend to kind of fall a little bit. Got these huge blooms on it. We get a little bit of rain. Those rain gets captured into this bloom and it starts to bend that branch down, and they can kind of look a little sad after a rainfall when you think everything would perk up. But they're coming out with new varieties that have much stronger stems. But this one, also easy. Blooms on new wood, so it's much easier. You're gonna see a lot of these with that kind of lime color. This one you can see some new blooms coming out like this guy up here, but then in these older ones kind of fade to the lime color. Some of them will blush as well to a pink hue sometimes, but they're really kind of great one. I think on this picture you can probably see it the best. They're called smooth hydrangeas because they got a very smooth leaf, so you're usually gonna see that with them. They're almost always a white color. Sometimes you'll get them that are just kind of more on the lime side, and they do make some that come out in pink as well. But you rarely will ever see anything blue when they come to a smooth hydrangea. But bloom on new wood, so you prune them in the winter. Easy. I like to prune these pretty aggressively. I like to cut them down to about 12 inches because the stronger the wood that you cut into on these, the stronger the wood that's going to come out. And that's kind of important. Some people will even cut them down to the ground. I don't know that I'd be that aggressive. I've never done that before. But I like to cut them right to about 12 to 18 inches from the ground. And that way I get nice, long, strong shoots next year out of nice, strong wood. And then that way they'll bloom on that very easily, and they tend to hold up a little bit and hold those big, huge blooms up a little bit better. So that's kind of how you can kind of see the differences. So I want to go back real quick and just kind of talk about one other thing. Let me see if I can find my picture here. So great picture here to kind of show you, because I know sometimes another question that is brought up is, how do I control the color of my hydrangea? Well, really only color manipulation can happen with your big leaf, repeat bloomers, but also your old-fashioned mop head type of hydrangeas. And the best way to control the color is lime is going to make them more neutral or alkaline, and that's going to give you pink blooms. And then acidic blooms are going to give you blue. So if you live in our neck of the woods, you plant a hydrangea, you're most likely going to get them blue. If you've got oaks, maples, pines growing nearby, anywhere in your neighborhood, you've probably got acidic soil. If you're in Pennsylvania, where it's just naturally more alkaline, you're gonna see a lot more pink hydrangeas. But here we're gonna get blue. So if you want them pink, throw some lime underneath them. You wanna do that in the February time frame, so a great time if you're pruning your other hydrangeas, not these guys, because we're gonna prune these in the summer typically. Then you throw a little bit of lime underneath them, and in that year, it takes a little bit of time, so we got to get that lime down early. So if you're like, I wanted to change my blue ones into pink this year, it's not going to probably happen, especially if they're already blooming. But throw some lime underneath them. I like to kind of scatter it a little bit and not get it super specific, and then you get something looking like this, where you get some blue, you get some mauves, you get some pinks, and so you get kind of this multicolored bush, especially if you kind of keep it more on one side, or if you're just not really, caring too much and you just kind of throw some lime underneath. If you want to make them blue and you got pink ones, there are some pink varieties that will remain pink. You cannot change the color. It's always going to be pink. But most varieties you can, and if you look at your tag, you're going to see that it'll say this can be changed from blue to pink. If you want them blue, you need a soil acidifier, so a sulfur. Basically, a soil sulfur is going to lower the pH and allow you to get blue blooms. And you still want to do that in that February time frame. Happens a little bit faster, but not fast enough that once they're blooming, you can't change them that year, typically speaking. There are some faster limes that will raise your pH a little bit faster, like Magical, that you can actually raise your pH a little bit quicker. But typically, once they start to bloom, they're going to be that color, and there's not going to be a whole lot of hope of changing them in that season. So you got to do that in that kind of February time frame. All right, so we went through the 4 different types. We've got our smooth hydrangeas, we've got our mop heads, old-fashioned and repeat bloomers, we've got our paniculatas, panicle styles, and we've got our oak leaf hydrangeas. And then in this mop head family, we've got repeat bloomers, traditional, and we've got lace caps that we've got to all kind of figure out. And the best thing to do is bloom these or prune these right after they're done blooming, which means typically around that midsummer time frame. It's an easy thing to remember. If you need to resort back to this video, you can always check it out on our website, and it'll help you to kind of diagnose some of your hydrangeas and what types you might have. And when you're purchasing hydrangeas, it's important to kind of remember where they are. I always like to draw a diagram of my landscape so that I know kind of where I've planted things. I can name them. I'll keep my tags. Sometimes I'll even keep my tag on the plant if I can. That way I can kind of always go back and figure out what variety it is. And it's always good to have some notes when it comes to your landscape and what kind of hydrangeas you're growing, because it can be confusing, but if you know the type of hydrangea you have, then it's really easy to know how to prune. It's either in the winter, around February time frame, or it's going to be in the summer, right when it's done blooming. Know if it's new wood or old wood when it blooms on, and then problem solved. So I hope that really helped you all when it comes to pruning your hydrangeas. A real short, simple webinar. I hope this helps you all. I don't see any questions, so I guess I've got everybody's everybody's got the information that they need. If you've got any questions, feel free to ask them. And if not, then we will sign off and we'll see you next time. I hope you all enjoyed this and enjoy gardening. Have a great day, everybody. Bye.